Ever wondered why we yawn all day, but dream of changing the world in a major way? It's the Bored and Ambitious Show.
The Men Who Broke the Mob. A story of crime, courage, and the century it took for the rule of law to win. 1860. Giuseppe Garibaldi marches into Sicily with 1,000 red-shirted volunteers and rewrites the map of Europe. Within months, a peninsula of fractured kingdoms becomes one nation, Italy. The world celebrates a triumph of unification. But on the island of Sicily, unification meant something else entirely. The old Bourbon rulers vanished overnight. And the new Italian state? It sent tax collectors. It sent conscription officers. It sent nothing else. No judges, no police, no courts that spoke the local language or understood local custom. Sicily wasn't liberated. It was abandoned. Nature abhors a vacuum. So does human society. When the state disappeared, someone had to settle the dispute between the farmer and his neighbor. Someone had to ensure the merchant's goods reached market without being stolen. Someone had to enforce the contract when no court existed to hear the case. Into that void stepped men who called themselves, with no irony whatsoever, men of honor. They weren't thugs. Not yet. They were the only law available. A landlord needs his peasants controlled. The men of honor negotiate the terms. A peasant needs protection from a predatory landlord. The same men broker the peace. A citrus shipment needs safe passage to the docks of Palermo. For a reasonable fee, it arrives untouched. They didn't replace the government. They became the government. One handshake, one favor, one obligation at a time. And what did Sicilians call these men? They used a word that had nothing to do with crime: Mafia. In the Sicilian dialect of the 19th century, it meant something beautiful: swagger, boldness, self-possession. A man with Mafia was a man who commanded respect, who walked through the world unafraid. It was a compliment. The most dangerous criminal organization in history began as a term of admiration. The Mafia's genius wasn't violence, it was indispensability. They made everyone need them. The wealthy landowners, they needed enforcers to keep peasants in line. The peasants, they needed protectors to survive the landowners. Politicians needed votes delivered. Merchants needed debts collected. And the church looked away, its silence purchased with generous donations and convenient blindness. Thread by thread, a web of mutual dependency spread across the island. Not a conspiracy imposed from above, but a system grown from below, binding every class, every institution, every transaction. They controlled the lemons that fed the world's thirst for citrus, the sulfur that fueled the Industrial Revolution, the water that meant life or death in a parched land. Every crate loaded onto ships, taxed, every miner descending into yellow darkness, accounted for. Every drop released to desperate fields, negotiated. For a century, nothing moved, nothing grew, nothing prospered in Sicily without their permission. The 1860s, birth in the chaos of unification. The 1880s, consolidation as the old ways hardened into tradition. By 1900, the Mafia wasn't a foreign body infecting Sicily. It was Sicily, woven so deeply into the island's economy, politics, and daily life that removing it seemed as impossible as removing the mountains themselves. These roots would need another century and another continent to finally be torn out. But the land could no longer hold them. Between 1880 and 1920, 4 million Sicilians, nearly half the island's people, fled poverty and boarded ships bound for America. They were masons and miners, mothers and dreamers, seeking the promise of something better. Most carried nothing but calloused hands and desperate hope. They would build America's railroads, dig its tunnels, raise its cities. But among those millions, a handful carried something else. the old knowledge, the old ways. And as their ships cut through the Atlantic fog toward a new world, so too traveled the shadow. New York, 1900. 4 million Sicilians have crossed an ocean, fleeing poverty, seeking hope. But in the cramped tenements of the Lower East Side, they find something unexpected, familiar chaos. The police don't speak their language. The courts might as well be on the moon. In this confusion, old patterns emerge. Men who know how to settle disputes, who can protect a pushcart vendor, who remember how things worked back home. Then came the gift no one expected. January 17, 1920, a gavel falls, and America goes dry. Prohibition, the noble experiment, and overnight, the rules of the game transform completely. Suddenly, 13 million Americans want something they can't legally have. Suddenly, there are billions in illegal alcohol waiting to be made, moved, and sold. The Italian gangs had something the competition lacked: organizational discipline forged over generations. They knew how to keep secrets. They knew how to move product across territory lines. They knew how to make sure everyone got paid. While federal agents smashed barrels for the cameras, rivers of whiskey flowed through the night. 2 young men saw further than anyone. Salvatore Lucania, they'd call him Lucky Luciano, born in Sicily, raised in Manhattan, with eyes that could read a room and a mind that thought in systems. Meyer Lansky, the son of Jewish immigrants, barely 5 feet tall, with a mathematical genius for money. Where the old bosses saw neighborhoods, these 2 saw a nation. Where the mustache Petes clung to vendettas and village grudges, Luciano and Lansky saw something revolutionary. A corporation, an American corporation. So September 1931. The Castellamarese War has torn New York apart, boss against boss, body after body, but Luciano has been planning. In a single coordinated strike, the old guard falls. Joe Masseria, dead in a Coney Island restaurant. Salvatore Maranzano, dead in his Park Avenue office. The age of the mustache. Pete's ends in blood. And from that blood, something unprecedented rises. The Commission. 5 families, 1 table. Order from chaos. The Sicilian way, perfected for America. In 1931, the men who murdered the old mustache Petes didn't just seize power. They invented something new. They called it the Commission. 5 families, 5 bosses, 1 ruling council. Think of it as a board of directors for organized crime. They established rules for dispute resolution. No more bloody wars that attracted police attention. They allocated territories like corporate franchises. They planned successions years in advance. Decades later, Fortune 500 companies would study their management structure. The irony? America's most successful criminals had built a corporation before corporate America learned how. They invented the franchise model. Crews in Chicago, Kansas City, New Orleans, all paying tribute to New York. They perfected protection as a subscription service. Pay monthly, stay in business, miss a payment. Well, and the unions? The unions became cash machines. Control the Teamsters? You control what moves. Control what moves. You control everything. Gambino. Genovese. Lucchese. Colombo, Bonanno. 5 names that would define organized crime for half a century. New York was headquarters, but their reach extended everywhere. Vegas, Miami, Los Angeles. From the waterfronts to the heartland, an invisible empire, hiding in plain sight. 1931 to 1985. 54 years. The Great Depression came and went. A world war was won. The Cold War froze and thawed. Presidents rose and fell. And through it all, the same men sat in the same social clubs, running the same empire. Everyone in America knew they existed. No one could prove a thing. They ran the Teamsters. 2 million workers, the largest union in America, their pension fund a personal piggy bank. They built Las Vegas from nothing but sand and ambition, turning the desert into a monument to cash. They controlled every ship that docked in New York Harbor, every ton of garbage hauled from Manhattan streets, every bag of cement poured into the skyline. Look at the city. Really look. The tunnels you drive through, the skyscrapers you work in, the bridges you cross. The Mafia didn't just profit from America's growth. They literally built it. Their hands were in the concrete, and the concrete is still standing. And America. America looked the other way. Joseph Kennedy courted mob connections to fuel his son's presidential campaign. The CIA partnered with Mafia bosses to assassinate Fidel Castro, using the same men they should have been prosecuting. And J. Edgar Hoover, the most powerful lawman in the nation, spent decades insisting the Mafia simply did not exist. Why? Some say blackmail, some say racism. He preferred chasing communists. Perhaps he simply knew he couldn't win. Whatever the reason, the man who saw threats everywhere refused to see the one operating in plain sight. A conspiracy of convenience. Everyone benefited from the silence, except the people living under it. Omerta. The code of silence. Break it, and you die. Your family dies. Everyone you ever loved dies. So witnesses went mute, cases collapsed, and the bosses walked free, smiling for the cameras, untouchable as kings. For half a century, that single word was stronger than any law. In 1970, Congress passed a law with a cumbersome name, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO. For 10 years, it gathered dust, prosecutors unsure of its power, judges untested in its reach. But buried in its language was a revolutionary idea. You could convict a boss for crimes he never personally committed. If you could prove a pattern of racketeering, the man giving orders was as guilty as the man pulling the trigger. A weapon was waiting. It just needed someone bold enough to use it. His name was Joseph Pistone, clean-cut FBI agent, family man from New Jersey. In 1976, he walked into a Brooklyn social club wearing gold chains and a leather jacket and became someone else entirely. Donnie Brasco, jewel thief, hustler, a man with no past and hungry eyes. For 6 years, he lived the lie. He drank with killers, earned their trust, watched men die and kept his cover. The Bonanno family embraced him so completely, they were weeks away from making him a made man, from inducting an FBI agent into the American Mafia. No one had ever gotten this close. No one had ever stayed this long. Every day, Pistone gathered evidence. Every night, he wondered if tomorrow would be his last. When Pistone finally surfaced and took the witness stand, he didn't just testify, he detonated a bomb inside the myth of Omerta. If the FBI could plant a man that deep for that long, then no one could be trusted. The code of silence, the sacred vow that had protected the mob for a century, developed cracks that would never heal. Wise guys started looking over their shoulders, and some of them started to talk. Rudy Giuliani was 40 years old, relentlessly ambitious and convinced he saw something others had missed. RICO wasn't just a law, it was a siege weapon. And Giuliani intended to aim it at the heart of the Mafia itself. Not one boss, not one family. All 5. The Commission, the Board of Directors of American Organized Crime, in a single trial. Everyone said it was impossible. Giuliani didn't care. On his office wall hung photographs of the most powerful criminals in America. He studied them like a general studies a map before invasion. February 1985. A federal courtroom in Manhattan, and something the world had never seen. The bosses of all 5 families seated together, not at a wedding, not at a funeral, as defendants. For half a century, these men had been untouchable. They gave orders, but never pulled triggers. They took profits, but never signed checks. The old laws couldn't reach them, but RICO could. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, written in 1970, ignored for a decade, finally had prosecutors who understood its power. You didn't need to prove the boss committed the murder. You needed to prove he ran the enterprise that did. November 19th, 1986. The verdict. Guilty, 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 guilty. 100 years of sentences. The men who thought themselves kings, led away in handcuffs. What everyone said was impossible had just happened. Across the Atlantic, two childhood friends were waging their own war. Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino grew up in the same Palermo neighborhood where the Mafia ruled. They played in the same streets. They saw the same silence, the same fear. And they made the same choice, to become prosecutors. In Sicily, this was not a career. It was a death sentence with a delay. They knew it. Their families knew it. They did it anyway. Together they would build something unprecedented, a case so vast, so meticulous, that even the Sicilian Mafia could not escape it. February 1986, Palermo, Sicily. A courtroom like no other. They built it as a bunker, reinforced concrete, 30 cages for defendants, room for 500 lawyers. Because this trial needed a fortress. 475 mafiosi, 19 months of testimony. Evidence painstakingly gathered by Falcone and Borsellino, piece by piece, witness by witness. December 1987. The verdict. 338 convicted. 2,600 years of sentences, the largest mafia trial in human history. For the first time in a century, Sicily had fought back and won. May 23, 1992. Judge Giovanni Falcone's motorcade approaches Palermo. Beneath the highway, half a ton of explosives. The blast leaves a crater 60 feet wide. Falcone, his wife, 3 bodyguards, gone. 57 days later, the Mafia strikes again. Judge Paolo Borsellino. Same method, same message. In all their centuries of violence, this was their most brazen act and their greatest mistake. The Mafia expected terror. They got a revolution. Hundreds of thousands poured into the streets of Palermo, not cowering, but furious. Sheets hung from balconies painted with a single word: basta, enough. The wall of omertà didn't crack. It collapsed. Witnesses who'd stayed silent for decades stepped forward. Pentiti, turncoats, flooded prosecutors' offices. The code of silence died where it was born. That same year, across the Atlantic, another reckoning. John Gotti had beaten 3 federal cases. The tabloids crowned him the Teflon Don. Then his underboss, Sammy Gravano, walked into the FBI and started talking. April 2nd, 1992. Guilty on all counts. Gotti died in prison 10 years later. The invincible on both continents had fallen. Walk through Little Italy today. 3 blocks of tourist restaurants where families pose for photos, not protection payments. The Fulton Fish Market runs clean. The Garment District pays no tribute. And the grandchildren? They became doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs who build instead of break. The neighborhoods that once lived in fear became the safest in New York. In Palermo, anti-mafia murals cover the walls where silence once ruled. School children learn the names of Falcone and Borsellino, not as victims, but as heroes. 2 continents, 2 reckoning, 1 truth. The rule of law won, not quickly, not easily, but it won. This is the complete arc. From a failed state that created a shadow government, to an empire that seemed eternal, to a fall that proved no one is above the law. A story about institutions that eventually work, about brave men and women who risked everything, about patience, courage, and the long arc of justice. The rule of law won, even when it took a century.